Hello and welcome to Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White, and today we'll be covering one of the most controversial subjects in the world and definitely in the US. But it's something that I think a lot of Americans don't really know enough about. And so we're going to get into the details of this today. I'm talking about an issue that is at the heart of a whole host of other issues, and it's one that has a lot of different names depending on your perspective. Our guest today, Dr. Rashid Khalidi, calls it the 100 Years War on Palestine in his 2017 book of that title. And as a Palestinian American, he is one of the most respected historians of the modern Middle East. Professor Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University, and he's the author of a large number of books and articles dealing with the Middle East, and in particular, the role of imperialism, colonialism, and the US in that region. Professor Khalidi, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And as I was preparing these introductory remarks, I was thinking, how can I actually specify this conflict in the most accurate way? Because there are a lot of different ways of interpreting it. We have a course at Marshall University here where I teach that's called the Arab-Israeli conflict. How would you describe it?
Well, the problem with the term conflict is that it implies some form of equality between the two sides. And that is not and has never been the case here. What's really at issue is the takeover of a country and the ethnic cleansing of its indigenous population by a combination of a settler movement, which was a national movement, and very powerful external forces, overwhelmingly powerful external forces. And so it has the nature of a conflict in that, if you think of the resistance of Native Americans to the, westward drive of colonization across the North American continent, that was a conflict, but it was not an equal one. And it was not one in which, it was not France versus Germany, which is often the way this is pictured. Oh, they're two peoples or they're two national movements, and they're just, a conflict over the land. There was a people that was in residence, and it was gradually overwhelmed and defeated and ethnically cleansed by another group that came in, formed a people, saw itself or came to see itself as a people, but was always backed by enormously powerful external forces. That's why I use the term 100 Years War on Palestine. Britain declared war on Palestine with the Balfour Declaration, saying that that country should become a Jewish national home, and explicitly specifying that there be no national or political rights for the overwhelming Arab majority of the population. That was a declaration of war, which the British actually carried out militarily later on during their rule over Palestine. So the idea that it's just a number of Jews and a number of Arabs, or the Zionist movement, or Israel and the Palestinians, is completely false. It was always very powerful external forces. The United States and the Soviet Union in 1948, arming Israel. What are the United States and Soviet Union in 1947, 48? They're the two greatest powers in world history. So it's not just a bunch of heroic Israelis fighting off the Arabs. It's Israel plus the two greatest powers in history against the Palestinians, and then later against several Arab armies. So I think that the term conflict, in fact, reduces it to something that it is not, and leads us in the wrong direction. How would I describe it? I describe it as a war on the Palestinians or on Palestine, and it's been going on to deprive them of their rights and deprive them of their homeland, and turn Palestine into Israel, which is what is happening sort of before our very eyes.
And of course, this has been going on for a century specifically there, but the roots of this conflict go back even further than that into the colonial era, into imperialism and all that. And your book certainly touches on that. But what we get in the beginning, in the introduction and chapter 1, is really kind of this glimpse about this relatively small area and how it fits into this broader conflict among a bunch of other empires at the closing of World War I.
Right. I mean, the thing that people don't recognize when they look at what Britain does in 1917, when it issues the Balfour Declaration, at the time that British armies are conquering Palestine, is to take over a vital strategic point on the border of Egypt, the Mediterranean connection point between the shortest route between the Gulf and the Mediterranean. Something that the British had their eyes on for long before they came into contact with or began to think of dealing with the Zionist movement. In other words, British imperialism had decided Palestine was vital to its interests before the British cabinet in 1917 decides to use the Zionist movement to further those interests. And people, if they don't see that, they think, oh, they have sympathy for the poor Jewish populations that are persecuted in Eastern Europe by the Tsarist tyranny and by anti-Semitism in Austro-Hungary. Well, the man who issued the Balfour Declaration was responsible for the Alien Exclusion Acts of 1905, which kept Jewish refugees from Tsarist anti-Semitism from entering Britain. The idea that this was a sympathy for the Jewish people or some kind of philo-Semitism on the part of somebody like Balfour is completely false. The man is responsible for one of the most anti-Semitic acts of legislation in British history. He was prime minister at the time that act was passed. The Alien Exclusion Act was directed at Jews. So it clearly was an act of imperial strategic planning, which led the British to support the Zionist project. The Zionist project, of course, had its own objectives. And that's one of the weird things when you talk about settler colonialism in Palestine. Most other settler colonial movements are extensions of the metropole. The French sent French people to Algeria to make Algeria French. The British colonized East Africa with the idea that these settlers will take over Kenya and will dominate it, and it will become part of the British Empire. The Zionist project was not made up of British people. It was not an extension of the British metropole the way North American colonies or Australia and New Zealand or Kenya or Rhodesia or South Africa were. It was a project put together by a nascent national movement, the Zionist movement, which saw the Jews as a modern people in the national sense, not as a religious group or a religious people, and which hitched a ride, as it were, on the back of the British Empire, using the British as the British were using them for several decades. And people don't, I think you have to understand that. And then the fact that that movement then managed to acquire other patrons, the Americans and the Soviets in 1947, when they both basically ram the partition resolution through the General Assembly on twisting and bribing and so on, and then arming the new state of Israel as soon as it's founded in 1948. So again, the role of imperial strategic interest, whether Soviet or American or British or French, at different stages, is absolutely vital to understanding what's going on. It's not just Jews and Arabs, in other words. It's not just Palestinians and Israelis. That's obviously the core of it. This is a struggle over a country, over a piece of land, over a narrative too. But it is also a global struggle in which British imperialism and later French and Russian, Soviet, American interests are all involved.
And so your book is actually broken down into 6 declarations of war. And this is really crucial, I think, for our listeners and future readers of your book and your other works to understand, because this is kind of a different tack than other books on this subject have given. I'm thinking in particular of Ian Black's Enemies and Neighbors, or any number of other books too that will follow the same timeline, perhaps, or something similar to that. Maybe they even go back to the late 1800s with the beginnings of modern Zionism. But looking at it in terms of these declarations of war, then what made you choose kind of that tack?
Because any account that starts with the Palestinians or the Israelis has got a hold of a part of the reality. Obviously, the Palestinians as a people develop, the idea of Zionism develops at a specific time, late 19th, early 20th century. And those become the key protagonists, obviously. But I am arguing in this book that what happens essentially through what I call these declarations of war, which are, generally speaking, actions not by Israelis or Palestinians, or by Zionist Jews or Palestinian Arabs, but rather by great powers. The Zionist movement starts, as you mentioned, in the late 1800s, and there are various ideas about Zionism and so on that they're circulating through the latter part of the 19th century. It becomes a dynamo with power only with the alliance with Britain. So the Balfour Declaration, which I describe and the mandate for Palestine that's issued to Britain by the League of Nations, I describe as a declaration of war on the indigenous population by an imperial power, not by the Zionist movement, by Britain. It's not the Zionist movement that wages that war, it's Britain. The Palestinians are not crushed by the power of the Yeshuva, of the Jewish community in Palestine, led by the Zionist movement. They're crushed by the British Empire, 100,000 troops, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, auxiliaries brought in from Ireland. The Palestinian Constabulary was formed of veterans of the Royal Irish Constabulary, who were disbanded in 1921 when Ireland gets its independence. They shipped 700 of those guys out to Palestine, having ruled one outpost of empire and suppressed it and controlled it there, moved to another outpost of empire to suppress it and control it. And that's the backbone. British imperialism is the backbone of the war on the Palestinians, which later on leads to 1948. So that's why each of these chapters has that structure of describing a sanction by the great powers for what happens on the ground. So whether you're talking about the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate before, during and right after World War I, or whether you're talking about the Partition Resolution of 1947, passed by the General Assembly after World War II, these are not actions by the Zionist movement or the Palestinians or the Arabs. They're actions by great powers. Same thing is true in 1967. Israel goes to war. It goes to war after taking permission in Washington from the president and from the Secretary of Defense. They send Meir Amit, the head of the Mossad, to Washington. They don't want to make the mistake they made in 1956 when they went to war together with Britain and France without American permission. This time they get American permission. It's not an Israeli war. It's an Israeli war with American permission. And I argue that the resolution that comes out of the 67 war, UN Security Council Resolution 242, is another declaration of war on the Palestinians. And it's not an Israeli declaration. Israel didn't write it. Abba Eban was there at the elbow of Ambassador Goldberg and Lord Carradine, who are the real drafters of the resolution. It's drafted in Washington, London, and New York, but by the great powers, not by the Israelis. The Israelis have input. The Israelis are allies. It expresses Israeli desiderata, but it's an American decision. And the Soviets sign on. Soviet Union could have vetoed it. They did not. So I'm arguing that these are declarations of war. The Palestinians are never mentioned in Security Council Resolution 242. Supposedly the basis for peace in the Middle East. What's the core of the quarrel? Isn't it between Palestinians and Israelis? Israel is mentioned repeatedly in the resolution. Where are the Palestinians? They don't exist. Just like in the Balfour Declaration, where they are never mentioned. The Palestinians are never mentioned in Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967. So I describe these as declarations of war. When you set out a framework for resolution of something, and you never mention one of the parties, you intend to eliminate them. They're not an actor. They don't count. And that was the intention of 242. That was an Israeli desideratum, but the Americans are the ones who executed it. So that's the structure of the book, as you suggest, these 6 declarations of war.
And now that you explained it this way too, after going through the book a number of times myself, I was really trying to get a strong handle on it each time I read it. But now with the emphasis that you're making on the role of these bigger powers, it makes much more sense. But at the same time, it's like you are going up against this broader narrative that a lot of Americans and Israelis have bought into, that goes back to Exodus and other films where you kind of look at the agency of the people themselves, and it's
right,
tugging on the heartstrings and all that.
Well, I mean, it should be said that the British or the Americans or whoever are not acting in a vacuum. First of all, they are championing this colonial settler movement, which at the same time is a national movement and brings into being this vibrant and powerful nation state and this people, the Israeli people. On the other hand, the Palestinians are resisting all the way through. They fight the British for 3.5 years, from 1936 to 1939. They carry out the longest general strike in the history of the interwar period in the entire colonized world. So they're fighting tooth and nail against this process. And the Zionists are fighting tooth and nail to establish themselves and to take over Palestine. So obviously, those protagonists are there, and I focus on them, obviously, throughout the book. And that continues to the present day. I mean, we saw last May, in different ways, forms of Palestinian resistance, whether in Jerusalem or in the cities inside of Israel or in Gaza or around Gaza, or in countries bordering Israel, Lebanon and Jordan, where Palestinian refugees became involved. That the Palestinians have obviously are not just lying back and taking this; they're still resisting. in different ways. And so both of those processes, which is to say the process of the absorption of Palestine into Israel and forcing the Palestinians into smaller and smaller spaces where they can't be forced out of Palestine entirely, those processes are still ongoing. I mean, Israel is still building settlements in the West Bank, is still exporting its population into the West Bank, is still enclosing and controlling and compressing the areas where the Palestinians can function. Those processes have never stopped from the very beginning. From the very beginning of land purchase back in the 1880s and 1890s and early 20th century, right up to today, where the Israeli bulldozers are at work or where land is being fenced off or people's homes are being destroyed. Those processes have never stopped. And that's another obviously important focus of the book. This is not just great powers. This is also a settler colonial project, which has turned into a nation state. And again, people say, how can you talk about Israel as a settler colonial project? Well, first of all, the early Zionists talked about themselves that way without any shame. And secondly, we are living inside a settler colonial project, which was entirely successful in ethnically cleansing North America and turning it into Canada and the United States. And we are peoples. There's a Canadian people and there's an American people, just like the Israelis. So, or the Australians, or the people of New Zealand. And in all of those cases, you had resistance. And in all of those cases, it was more or less successful. So it's actually not that hard to get your head around the fact that, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can be a settler colonial project, which Zionism always has been. The idea being to take over this land and turn it from Palestine into Israel, the land of Israel. Those are the words of one of the great political thinkers and leaders of the Zionist movement, a man named Zev Jabotinsky. He said, we're going to turn it from, what we're trying to do is turn it from Palestine into the land of Israel. And that's the motivating spirit of governments of Israel, certainly for the last 30 or 40 years, since the 70s. They have not been, they've not shown any reluctance in admitting that they consider that this is a country which has one people, the Jewish people, one group that has legitimate rights, and the rest of us are there on sufferance if we're allowed to be there at all. And that's the motivating logic behind any colonial settler movement. It belongs to us, and if we allow you to be here, it'll be on our terms, on reservations, in Bantustans, in the Palestinian Authority Area A, whatever terminology is used for how the native population is cantoned and controlled and dominated and kept in line, if they're not physically eliminated or kicked out.
Sure. And it seems like whenever there are conflicts like this year, 2014, the beginning of the first Intifada, going back to, or second and first, all the way back, Lebanese civil war as well, that there's always this counter narrative that's coming from Israel or from the pro-Israel side in the United States that says, well, that without our assistance, without Israel's militarism, then they would be annihilated. There's all this kind of catastrophizing. And it's very difficult for a lot of people who don't study this on a minute level to have a counter argument to that in their minds. What's the best kind of response to that argument?
Well, I mean, part of this, it has to be said, is rooted in the Holocaust. Israel comes into being in many ways as a result of what the Nazis are doing in Germany, starting in 1933. I don't want to go into the details.
Sure.
But it is really important to understand that this haunting sense of existential threat is something that I would argue to some extent is always there, but it is obviously multiplied many fold by what happens during the Holocaust. And this idea of the Jewish people being, on the brink of annihilation is something that's not an unrealistic fear in light of what happens between 1933 and 1945 in Germany and in the countries that Germany conquers. So that's the background. Secondly, Israel is a tiny little country. That's all that's true. And it is surrounded by a large number of people who, by their colonial activities, have been alienated. I mean, you kick a bunch of people out and the neighbors are not going to be happy. And that's what Israel did. And so it has created a hostility for itself, which is genuine. To this day, good opinion polling all over the Arab world indicates enormous sympathy for the Palestinians and indicates a lot of resistance to the idea of normalizing with Israel, unless the Israelis come to terms on a just basis with the Palestinians. There's polling almost every year that shows that. So Israel's perception of external threat caused by its own actions, let it be understood, is legitimate. I mean, there is that. There is that. On the other hand, while Israel barely wins the 1948 war, they win it, but they barely win it. They handily defeat everybody else in every war thereafter. Even if it doesn't look quite as handily as it was, as easy as it was, in retrospect, if you look at the 1956 war, if you look at the 1967 war, if you look at the war of attrition between 68 and 70, if you look at the 73 war, in which Israel at first was driven back and then won, or you look at the 1982 war, Israel has never been in any danger of annihilation. Now, they may have perceived that they were, and that may have been a genuine perception. But I cite in the book the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the head of the US intelligence community saying in 67, you will either whip them if you attack them first, or you'll beat them handily if they attack you first. But you're going to win decisively no matter what happens. Was that the Israeli perception? No. Israelis thought that they were in existential danger of being annihilated. They understood that, again, 1967 is how long after the Holocaust? It's 20 odd years, 22 years after the Holocaust has ended. That is understandable. It's not true. There was no danger whatsoever. Israel would either smash the Arabs or would completely defeat them. Those were the only two possibilities. And that reality, to be honest, I think is something that younger people are more easily able to accept than older people who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, or who grew up or were young at the time of the 67 war, when it really did appear, incorrectly, but it really did appear as if Israel was in existential danger. In other words, as if the very existence of the state of Israel was in peril. It wasn't, but people believed that it was, including many Israelis. Today, I think people see that Israel is a nuclear superpower. It towers over the Middle East. There are a couple of countries that can match it in power, Turkey and Iran, and that's about it. The Arab countries are like midgets compared to Israel. All of them put together are like a gang of midgets compared to Israel. And Israel is now economically, technologically, certainly militarily, overwhelmingly superior to any possible constellation of enemies, including Iran, which is the latest bogeyman. If the Iranians get one nuclear weapon, they'll have 1/100th or 1/200th of the capabilities that a nuclear-armed Israel with submarine-launched ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles and airborne weapons of mass destruction can wield against Iran. Iran will be annihilated totally if they dare to use a nuclear weapon. Totally annihilated. So the idea that Israel is in existential danger is no more true than that the United States and Russia today are in existential danger. We have huge arsenals. They have huge arsenals. We're not going to use them. They're not going to use them. We're rational. They're rational. The Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, all the other countries that have nuclear weapons are not in existential danger unless, heaven forbid, something completely untoward happens. And so the idea that this is poor tiny little Israel and a bunch of humongous, massive, powerful Arab or Muslim opponents is essentially a fantasy. It had some roots in reality at the very beginning. The Arabs were and are more numerous. But if you look at Israel today, Israel has allies in the Gulf who are closer to it than they are to the Palestinians. And it has allies in Egypt and in Jordan and in Morocco, which are long-standing friends of Israel. I mean, the king of Morocco back in the 60s assassinated an opposition leader, Medyoun Barka, with the support of Israeli intelligence. So this is 50 years of collaboration with Jordan, or 100 years more. The great-grandfather of the present king of Jordan was negotiating with the Zionist project back in the 30s, with the Zionist movement back in the 1930s. So Israel has, covert friends all over the region, and now overt friends all over the region. Who are the friends of the Palestinians? Well, public opinion. In an anti-democratic region dominated by authoritarian regimes, that and 5 cents will get you a cup of coffee. The people who support you, the governments, are terrified of Israel or want Israel's goodwill or want the goodwill of Washington, which is often dependent on your doing what the Israelis want. So Sudan normalizes with Israel essentially to get taken off the terrorist list. Sudanese public opinion is overwhelmingly against. But the generals decide we want to get taken off the terrorism list. We want to get access to funding. We recognize Israel. The road to Washington goes through Tel Aviv for the Sudanese generals. So Israel is in an extremely powerful position, and people who don't recognize it are really living in the past, I'm afraid, or living in the midst of a propaganda cloud.
Sure. And this is, of course, something that a lot of people believe, which is that without US support, for example, then we won't be supporting the only democracy in the region. There's lots of kind of tropes that people say,
Right.
that without really thinking about it or without reading the history too much.
Right. Well, the only democracy in the region is one of those great tropes. For Israelis, Israel is a remarkably democratic country, especially for Jewish Israelis. Non-Jewish Israelis have been told that they do not have a right of national self-determination. The Jewish people are the only ones who do. So the 20% of Israelis who don't happen to be Jewish are essentially, by constitutional law passed in 2018, second-class citizens. Nevertheless, they operate within a democracy, just like the Jim Crow South was part of a democracy. The way Palestinian citizens of Israel are treated is a part of a democratic system. The only fly in the ointment is an enormous one, which is that Israel has ruled over almost as many Arabs in the occupied territories as there are Israelis since 1967. 1967 wasn't yesterday. 1967 is 54 years ago. 55, we're going on 55. That's 2/3 of the lifetime of the Israeli state, during which it was an imperial power controlling the lives of almost as many people as there are Israeli citizens in a manner that can't be described as democratic. And they weren't in another part of the world the way the Philippines was to the United States, or the way that, Vietnam was to France. They are right there, and there are Israelis living right on top of them. There are 700,000 or 800,000 Israelis, settlers, illegal settlers, living inside the occupied territories, in which 5 or 6 million Palestinians, almost 6 million Palestinians, have no political rights, basically. All the decisions in their lives are made by the Israeli government, Israeli security forces. Can you come in? Can you go out? Can you move from this place to that place? Can you have entry into Israel or not? Can you travel or not? Can you import? Can you export? All those decisions are made by Israel, sometimes by like a sergeant or a private at a checkpoint, not by the state of Israel or the Knesset and so on. So Israel is not a democracy in the sense that it controls the lives of 6 million people who have absolutely no voice in what is done in land use. I mean, think of anything that a government does. And the Palestinians don't have the right to do those things without Israeli approval. So, it is a democracy, a wonderful democracy, the way Athens was a wonderful democracy, except for the slaves. they didn't have any share in Athenian democracy. And if you miss that, you miss the overwhelming majority of the population.
And so this 1967 is usually considered to be kind of one of the biggest turning points in this history. And we can go back further and forward too, but I'd really like to double down on June 1967 and kind of set the stage for the listeners so they can understand the significance of the events leading up to it, as you said, in the United States,
right.
And also your own family's role in that too.
Right. We haven't touched on this, but one of the things that I try and do in this book, which has the structure that you've described of 6 chapters, each of which describes a declaration of war on Palestine. One of the things I try and do in this book is to illustrate this thesis through examples that are drawn from personal history, family history, the history of other families. And so I take people through these things, not just by a dry historical narrative, but by trying to describe what happened to me or to my father or to my wife's grandfather or whoever it may be. Or a distant relative who was a member of the Ottoman Parliament and who, writes to Herzl, that kind of thing. And so in 67, what I describe is exactly the situation I was talking about a minute ago, the enormous fear people felt for Israel. I described walking out of Grand Central Station on my way to the United Nations where my dad worked, and seeing people collecting money for Israel in a bed sheet right outside the doors of Grand Central on 42nd Street. I'll never forget it. It showed that people really were terrified. They really thought Israel was going to be eliminated. They were throwing money in, and it was, there was a state of high tension. And I described, my own witnessing of events in the Security Council during the war from the visitors gallery. My dad worked in the Secretariat of the United Nations, and he worked in what was then called Political and Security Council Affairs. And so he sat there every time the Middle East was discussed by the Security Council. And school was out. I'd finished my first year of university, and I was in New York, and I would go down to the UN with him every day for that week and more of the war and after, and sit in the visitors gallery and watch the Security Council. So I saw these resolutions being passed, and then I would meet up with my dad, and he would explain to me what was really going on, behind in the corridors behind what we saw. So I put that kind of stuff in the book because I think it's actually germane. I think it actually helps you to understand stuff, not because I had a necessarily privileged access, though occasionally I did. I mean, I was involved in the negotiations in Washington in the early 1990s. I was in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and siege of Beirut. The people I cite were, involved in the events that I describe. I talk about Yusuf Saïq, who was captured by the Israelis in 1948. He'd been trying to collect money for the Palestinian cause in Palestine. I cite his memoirs. I mean, I knew him, and I know his son and his two sons and his daughter. They're friends. So I'm using accounts of my family and other families that I was either told or that they've published in autobiographies or in biographies to illustrate the way in which this thing unfolded for Palestinians in particular.
Right, and it occurs to me too that you have an account in there about your father and your uncle, who was about twice as old as your father, right? In 1947.
He was an officer. He was already an officer in World War I when my dad was born. Exactly.
And this story about the discussion that your uncle sends your father to speak with the
Mir Abdullah of
Transjordan, right? Transjordan. I wanted to make sure I had that right. So this is something I hadn't heard before. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. The background to this is that in 1947, the United Nations is considering what to do about Palestine. The British have tossed the issue into the lap of the United Nations. The British have failed in Palestine. Their former proteges have turned against them. The Zionist movement is fighting with the British, and the British finally say, we can't deal with this. They crushed the Palestinians in the 30s, and in the years after World War II, the Zionist movement was fighting with them, was attacking and carrying out all kinds of terrorist attacks, blowing up buildings and so forth, assassinating officers. And so the General Assembly is deliberating this thing at a time that my dad was in the Middle East as an emissary of an Arab American Institute that had just been set up in New York, trying to gain the support of different Arab governments for this project. And he's on his way to Amman to talk to Emir Abdullah, later King Abdullah of Transjordan, what we call Jordan today. And he's about to leave, and his uncle, my uncle, his older brother, much older than him, as you mentioned, says, listen, I want you to take a message to Emir Abdullah. And he says, sure. And he says, Emir Abdullah has been saying he wants to take us under his protection. The Arabic word is wasaya. We've been telling him no. We've sent him message after message, turning down his kind offer, because we don't want to be dominated by the Jordanians. We believe we should be, we're an independent people. We should, have our own self-determination. We don't want to be controlled by the Jordanians, who are controlled by the British. His army is paid by the British, officered by the British, armed by the British, and ultimately controlled by the British. We're under British control now. We don't want to continue that with the fig leaf of Emir Abdullah. And my father says, but that's going to ruin my trip. I'm going to tell the guy that I want him to support this project in the United States. And I'm supposed to tell him the Palestinians don't want your protection. And my uncle basically dismissed him. He said, just go and do as you're told. You're 20 years younger than me, whatever. Just go and do as you're told. My uncle at that point was the secretary of the Arab Higher Committee, which was the coordinating group for the Palestinians at the time. So my father tells me this a few months before he dies. He sits me down and he tells me this story. He says, I want you to remember this story. This is what happened to me in 1947. So he goes to Jordan. He meets the king in the palace, in Basman, I think it was palace. He tells him about this project in the United States. The king is not particularly interested. The king's, his bread is buttered by the British. He doesn't care about the United States. He doesn't know about the United States. Not a very far-sighted ruler, actually. And so my father says, by the way, Your Highness, I got to tell you, I have a message from my brother. And, Amir Abdullah perks up. And he says, thank you very much, but they don't really want your protectorship. And the reason that my uncle sent my father is because he knew that Abdullah would be forced to believe it coming from his brother. There's all the other emissaries, the king had said, no, you don't really represent what the Palestinians want. They must want my protection. But when my dad goes there, even though he's a young man, he's still the brother of the secretary of the Arab Higher Committee. So you got to take it serious. The king gets up. He becomes king very soon after. At this point, he's the emir. He gets up. Everybody in the room gets up. When the emir gets up, you get up. And he turns to my dad and he says, "You have turned down my offer, and you, the Palestinians, have turned down my offer. You deserve what's going to happen to you." And he stalks out. Just before he stalks out, somebody comes in and says, "Your Highness, the BBC has just reported that the General Assembly has passed the partition resolution." And it's at that point, that Abdullah then says to my father what he says and goes out. So I told this story to a friend of mine, an Israeli historian by the name of Avi Shleim, and he says, "Oh, that explains it." I say, "Explains what?" He says, "Well, I'm looking at the Israeli and the British and the Jordanian documents, and they all indicate that Abdullah keeps telling the Zionists, 'I'm going to get the Palestinians on board. Don't worry, I'll get the Palestinians on board. I will, you can count on me.' And then at a certain point, he starts telling Golda Meir and Moshe Chertok, the two emissaries, both of whom become prime ministers of Israel later on, foreign ministers and prime minister of Israel. He says to them, 'I'm sorry, I couldn't get the Palestinians on board.' He says, that explains it. When your father goes down, then finally Abdullah believes that the Palestinians will not follow his lead."
Wow.
So that's a story I put in there, which my father tells me, and which actually, Avi Shleim corroborates from the Israeli and the British and the Jordanian perspective.
And am I right to interpret this as a fairly ominous event? Could things have really turned out differently?
They might have. Had the Palestinians said, "We don't want independence. We don't want self-determination. We're happy having been stomped by the jackboot of the British. We're happy to let the Jordanians control us." Had they said that, the war would probably have still taken place. The Palestinians would have been dispossessed in most parts of Palestine. But the transition in some parts would have been different, maybe. The problem is that the Zionist movement had not never really fully accepted the partition resolution. They wanted much more. They wanted the whole country. They didn't have the means to take it in 47, 48. They had the means to take large areas that were overwhelmingly populated by Arabs, but they couldn't take the entire country, mainly because the Arab armies come in after May 15th, 1948, and hold on to two slivers, the West Bank, large areas, about 22% of the whole. So under the partition plan, the Jewish state would have gotten about 55% of Palestine. The best parts, actually. So the Jewish minority was given by the partition plan most of the country. By the end of the 1948 war, by the time of the armistice agreements in 1949, Israel controlled about 78% of the country. So 22% were retained or were preserved, as it were, by Jordan and then by Egypt in what we today call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
I guess
would that outcome have been different? I don't know. It's one of those might have beens of history.
Sure.
Had there not been the expulsion of several 100,000 Palestinians in the months before May 15th, the Arab armies might not have come in at all. One of the triggers for the very reluctant Arab states entering Palestine in 1948 was this flood of refugees arriving in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan from Palestine, driven out of towns and villages and cities in the months before May 15th, especially in late March, April, and the first half of May. The city of Jaffa, 60,000 people. The city of Haifa, 60,000 people. That's the Arab populations. They had large Jewish populations as well. The Arabs are driven out of both of those cities. They're driven out of Bisan. They're driven out of Tiberias. All of these before the Arab armies enter. And so that flood of several 100,000 people, maybe 300,000, maybe more, maybe a little less, is one of the major triggers of the Arab armies and trade. And so, anybody who says, well, the Palestinians accepting in November what the king said doesn't take into account that what happened largely because of this expansionist drive by these militias that later become the Israeli army, the Haganah, the Stern Gang, the Irgun, and so forth. Those are the people who are fighting in those months before May 15th. And then they're unified into the Israeli army on May 15th. The Israeli state is already there in embryo, created with the help of the British, starting with the Mandate in 1922. Everything that they had on May 15th, they already had. They already had a foreign ministry. It's called a political agency. They already had a military. They already had a parliament. They had everything that they had on May 15th, before May 15th, created with the help of the British. If you read the Mandate, the British are enjoined to help in the creation of these self-governing institutions. The Palestinians don't get that. But the Jewish population of Palestine, by the Mandate, is entreated to create the framework for a Jewish national home, which is to say a state, which they do with British help. I mean, it's their money and their effort and their ingenuity and so on, but it's under the umbrella and protection of the League of Nations and the British. And that's what fights in 1948. The Palestinians don't have that. They don't have a state in 1948. Now, could they have done more to create one or create a parastate? Yeah, probably. The Egyptians create in a political party, the left, a sort of counter-legitimation for the Indians create the Congress Party. The Palestinians never really have that level of political mobilization for reasons that I go into in the book.
Sure, that context is so important. The 3 decades or 2.5 decades, if you will, before, between 1922 and 1947, where there's a lot of migration coming in from Europe, especially during in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and a larger exodus of Jews from there, but also with the further development of British support for Jewish political and cultural educational entities, and this is at the expense of the Palestinians.
Right, and military. I mean, in
sure.
the 30s, the British arm and train thousands of people in the Jewish settlement police, in what were called the night squads, as auxiliaries to help them fight the Palestinians during the Great Revolt of 1936-39. The backbone of the Israeli army is not created by the Israelis; it's created by the British to help them in this fight. I mean, it's a desperate fight. The British lose control of the cities and much of the countryside briefly in 1937-38, and it's only after Munich when they can bring in a couple of divisions, because the whole British army is mobilized on the possibility of war with Germany. They cannot afford to put down this colonial insurgency. They can't send the RAF. They need every plane and every ship and every regiment to be ready to fight Germany in 1938. Once the Munich Accord, peace in our time, the British free up a huge number of troops, but they needed every auxiliary they could get. And that's where you have the Jewish settlement police, armed and trained. That's where you have the man named Ord Wingate, basically creates the ethos of the Israeli army with what are called the night squads, which are essentially counterinsurgency, assassination, and murder, penetration groups. Moshe Dayan is in one of these. Many of the leading officers who become commanders of the Israeli army are trained by Wingate and his folks in these night squads. And he's much honored by the Israelis now as sort of the guiding spirit of the ethos of the Israeli Defense Force.
A couple of things I wanted listeners to understand too is one, the kind of the impetus for that revolt in 1936, and two, going further back, the changing proportions of Jews versus Jews and Arabs in Palestine.
Right.
Let's go back to
very important.
the period where there's a really low number, 5%, you say,
right.
like in the early 1900s, right. And then it explodes into the 30s.
Right. And the numbers aren't really very solid, but it's in the range of 5, 6, 7% before and during World War I. And what happens is there's a huge increase in the proportion of the total population, the Jewish proportion of the total population. And it then plateaus in the late 20s and the early 30s at about 17 or 18%. So from 5 or 6% of the total population, or 7, or whatever it may have been, 1914, 16, 15, 16, 17, it goes up to 17 or 18%. And then it plateaus. And you have a period in the late 20s and the early 30s where it doesn't look like the Zionist project is going to have that kind of demographic impetus and dynamism that's going to enable them to take over the country. Then Hitler comes to power. And in 1 year, in 1935, as many immigrants arrive as the total Jewish population of the country in 1917. 60,000 people, more than 60,000, 61,000 legal immigrants arrive. There are probably more illegal immigrants. And the Jewish population as a proportion of the whole goes from 17 or 18% in the early 30s to 31% by the end of the 30s. And reading the diaries of people like Ben-Gurion, leaders of the Zionist movement, they say, I mean, this gives us the demographic weight that we've always needed. He realizes that at this rate, we're going to have a Jewish Palestine, a Jewish majority in Palestine. Of course, the Holocaust cuts that short. That population flow, which the Nazis allowed out before World War II, is cut off by the war, and then is cut off by the decision to murder the entire Jewish population in Nazi-occupied Germany. But that demographic battle that was going on in the 20s and the 30s is part of the struggle in the 1940s. The pressure that's put on Britain to allow more immigration, the British stop immigration in 1939, a particularly cruel decision, because coming at a moment when people could not get into Britain because of the Alien Exclusion Acts passed by Balfour in 1905, and because of racist American immigration laws, and could not get into many other countries for similar reasons. One of the only safe havens up until 1939 had been Palestine. And so you have this increase in population, which is not just a factor in the demographic balance between Palestinians and Jews in Palestine. It's also one of the only outlets for people escaping the Nazis. So there's this tragic, the other side of this is this tragic reality that because Britain and the United States are so cruel in not letting these people in, the only place that they're allowed to go is to help with this settler colonial project that's taking over Palestine. It's a particularly brutal reality. And they're escapees from what will become the Holocaust.
Right, I hadn't considered that 1939 cutoff just prior to the beginning of the Holocaust itself, with the Einsatzgruppen and then the death camps in Poland, ends up cutting off the last escape valve for European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews in particular. Whereas before, it had been the United States for about 4 million Jews fleeing from pogroms and oppression and all that.
Until we changed our immigration laws in the early 20s. Yeah.
I'd really like people to understand that part of it, that the changing of the immigration laws in both countries, in the United States as well as under the British mandate in Palestine, has a tremendous effect way on down the line too.
Right. I mean, our immigration laws and British immigration laws. I mean, I keep wanting to go back to the Alien Exclusion Act.
Sure.
It's not just us. It's the Brits. It's many other countries. I mean, these kinds of racist and discriminatory laws were being adopted all over the place. My mother's family was separated by that 1924 law. My grandmother came here with my mom and my uncle just before those laws were passed in the early 20s. And she could not bring her other 3 kids, who ended up emigrating to Australia with her sister. And she didn't see them for 30 years. It's not just, it was Jews, it was Italians, it was Arabs, it was many other people. And that has that knock-on effect that you're talking about. One of the reasons Zionism is successful, one of many reasons Zionism is successful, is that it appeals to this sense of there's no other place we can go. This is a refuge. And World War II and the Holocaust make it a decisive argument. One of the reasons the United States is won over in the way it's won over to this cause after World War II, of course, it's mainly strategic. Anybody who thinks it's the good-hearted nature of American policymakers really hasn't read anything written by American policymakers. It is strategic, but at the same time, there is a wave of sentiment in the United States of sympathy because of the revelations of the Holocaust. And the Zionist movement, of course, is able to capitalize on this.
Sure, that reminds me of I was just watching a talk by Daniel Gordis before our conversation, and I wanted to get a sense of his perspective on recent events, and he finalizes his talk by quoting Golda Meir as saying, "Well, this is the only place that we have," and that's
who is that? Danny who? Gordis, Daniel Gordis.
Right.
Yeah. the other.
But it occurred to me too that Gordis and Mayer and Netanyahu, well, not Netanyahu, but Gordon, Mayer and Gordis both were raised in the United States and then went to Israel afterwards. But they still have this strong sense that there really isn't any other place to go.
Right, right. Yeah, she was raised in Milwaukee. I think she was born in somewhere in Eastern Europe, raised in Milwaukee, and then emigrated to Palestine.
Okay, born in Ukraine, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But of course, and your mom was born in Lebanon, right?
That's right.
And so she came here before that 1924 law that cut off immigration pretty much to everybody outside of Western Europe, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Northwestern Europe.
Right, sure. A specific part of Western, yeah. Gosh, there's so much that we can go through here too. A couple of the things that I wanted people to understand too is the ways in which ever since 1967, this has kind of been almost like a puzzle that people are trying to solve, especially because in my mind, it seems like the Palestinian people have been, based on the Palestinian people that I know, they've had to leave from what became now Israel proper into Jordan, and then others then onto Lebanon afterwards because of the Black September War and all that. And then so many went to Kuwait and many other places around the world too. Can you kind of talk about this struggle, especially of the Palestinians, to find a homeland of their own?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you've described the trajectory of an enormous number of Palestinian families. I mean, there are still some who managed to cling to their original towns and cities and villages inside Israel. There are too many Palestinians. Some of them were moved or forcibly had to leave and were not allowed to return to their original homes, but managed to stay inside Israel. In the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, there are people who are originally Gazans or from Nablus or from wherever. But for the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, what you just described is the trajectory that we've all been through. My grandfather lived on the outskirts of Jaffa. He's a Jerusalemite, but his last posting as a judge was in Jaffa, and he settled there in a house that's still there. It's on the cover of the book, actually. The ruins of it are on the cover of the book. Mm-hmm. He's forced to leave in 1948. My uncle slips through during a truce in the war and drags him out. He didn't want to leave. He stayed by himself. He sent my grandmother and a few younger members of the family away, and he stayed. And finally, my uncle says, "You're not safe here. You got to leave." So he's dragged away. He never sees his home again. He dies eventually in Nablus and is buried in Jerusalem. And members of the family are all over the place. I mean, I have cousins in Egypt, I have cousins in Jordan, I have cousins in Lebanon, I have cousins in Syria, I have cousins in Kuwait, I have cousins in Saudi Arabia, I have cousins in South Carolina, I have cousins in Massachusetts. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Australia, the works, all over Europe. And most Palestinian families are the same. There's a minority, those who manage to stay, either inside Israel or inside the occupied territories. But actually, they're a minority. Most of us, even people who still live in Palestine, many of them are not living in their original homes. They're living in refugee camps, or they live in Ramallah, they live in Jerusalem, but they're originally from a place somewhere else that they were driven out of, or their parents or grandparents were driven out of back in 48, or in some cases as recently as 67.
And actually, it just reminded me about 12 years ago, I met a Palestinian couple that was running a youth hostel in Leon, Nicaragua, mm-hmm. of all places. And I mean, just the diaspora is just so far scattered. People can run across Palestinians. It seems like there's potential for another book there, right? The story of
I'm not going to write it, but there is. One of my students maybe can write it.
Sure.
In fact, I have a couple who worked on immigration. Of my former students. It's true. I mean, my son lives in Chile now, and there's a huge Palestinian community in Chile. They say 500,000 people. I don't think that's necessarily exactly right, but there are hundreds of thousands of them. And it's an immigration that goes back to the 1880s and 1890s. And most of these guys were people fleeing the draft, the Ottoman conscription, or seeking a better life or whatever it may have been. And unlike other Middle Eastern emigrations, which ended up in Mexico or Argentina or Brazil or wherever, or Central America. The Palestinians, especially from 3 villages, Beit Jela, Beit Sahur, and Bethlehem, ended up in Chile. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. I mean, I've been there several times, and it's extraordinary how many there are and how influential they are because they've been there for 100 years. It's an immigrant society. It's a settler colonial society. They're still fighting the Mapuche in the South, not with guns anymore. The guy who was defeated in the presidential election wanted to crack down on the Mapuche. The election 2 days ago, 3 days ago. And so they're immigrants like other people, but they came very, very early. They are very well established. They have a huge Palestine club. They supported a football team, Palestino. I have a hat, that Palestino. And they're one of the big teams in the Chilean league. And that was in 1920, 21 that these guys did this. So, I mean, there was already a community large enough to sustain a club and a football team 100 years ago. So it's a big immigration, and there's similar diaspora communities all over the place.
That gives some texture to this, to my experiences as well, meeting Palestinians in other countries, because they'll have, like in Nicaragua, they had very strong Nicaraguan accents. You know, they identified themselves though as Palestinos, and so it's not just about people leaving since the creation of Israel.
The Chilean Palestinians are the same. I mean, the older generations speak Arabic and they cook, you know, Middle Eastern food and so on. And only some of the younger ones are now coming to learn Arabic, but they all feel Palestinian. And they have an enormous sense of community, which is true all over the place with Palestinian diaspora communities.
And that relates.
I mean, I'm not the expert. I'm not an expert on this.
Sure.
I have students who've written about this. I have one who wrote about Palestinians in Chicago. You know, there's a whole genre there.
Well, I want to make sure we also get to some of the other events that affected your life tremendously, and something that also is really important for Americans to understand, I believe, which is the Lebanese Civil War. And that's what I was kind of getting at, where the 1967 war then leads to conflicts between, going on in Jordan, and then there's more. Then the PLO ends up going up to Lebanon.
Right. Well, I cover this in one of the later chapters of the book, leading up to the 1982 war. The Palestinians are defeated long before 1948. They're really defeated by the British in the late 30s. They're crushed. 1 in 10 adult male Palestinians is either killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British during the 3.5 years of the revolt from 36 to 39. And many of those leaders never are allowed to return to Palestine. And when the fighting breaks out after the partition resolution is passed in November 1947, the Palestinians very quickly lose that struggle, and hundreds of thousands of people are driven out. And the Palestinian national movement appears to be finished. And so in the 50s and the 60s, a new movement is resuscitated or rebuilt, which later on takes over the PLO, and which comes into conflict not only with Israel, but with the Arab host countries. So you've described the conflict with Jordan, which leads to what's called Black September, the expulsion of the Palestinian political leadership from Jordan. They move to Lebanon. And then a war is waged on them in Lebanon. We have the American papers, Foreign Relations of the United States series of documents published by the State Department, the historical section of the US State Department, gives us a lot of detail about how Kissinger, with the Israelis, with the Syrians, was engaged in fighting the Palestinians. I mean, there were no American soldiers involved. But the war on Palestine is not just a war of Lebanese militias, or just a war of the Israeli army, or just a war of the Syrian army, all of whom are fighting the Palestinians at different times during the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990. We had shells coming in from, I was living in West Beirut at the time. We had shells coming in from the Phalangist and other Lebanese forces militias with Iranian markings on them and with Saudi markings on them. And these are mortar shells, 81 millimeter mortar shells from the Saudi National Arsenal, and this is at the time of the Shah, mind you. At the same time, the Israelis were supporting the Phalangists and other right-wing Lebanese militias, which we have from Israeli documents that I cite in the book. And the Syrians come in against the PLO in 1976. So it's a complicated. It seems more complicated than it is, but Palestinian nationalism is a problem in different ways for these different actors. For the Lebanese, because they feel their country is being taken over, for some Lebanese, and eventually many Lebanese. For the Syrians, because the PLO won't bend to their wishes. For the Israelis, because they want to eliminate Palestinian nationalism. You can't take over the country and turn Palestine into Eretz, the land of Israel, if you still have a resistance movement, if you still have a national movement. And that's the objective of the Israelis in Lebanon, and the objective on which they're agreed, sometimes indirectly, with these other actors. So the Lebanese civil war has its own dynamic, but between Lebanese and between these various actors. It's not just a civil war, it's also a proxy war. So when you have mortar shells from Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you have Syrian troops and Israeli troops and various other actors engaged, it's a proxy war as well as a civil war. So it was all of those things with Lebanese protagonists and with the Palestinians and with the Syrians and the Israelis and all the others. The culmination of this is the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, where Ariel Sharon, who's then the Israeli Minister of Defense, and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin decide they're going to finish with the PLO once and for all. They're going to boot the Syrians out of Lebanon, and they're going to create a puppet regime, which will sign a peace treaty with Israel. Sharon goes to Washington. He meets with Secretary of State Haig. Haig gives him a green light for those objectives. So as in 1967, the fighting is done by the Israelis, but the approval comes in Washington. This is in May 1982. Early June, the invasion is launched. The Israelis sent several divisions. They eventually defeat the PLO in the south. They drive them south. They drive them north. They eventually defeat Syrian armored divisions in the Bekaa Valley. They drive them north. Not far enough north, however. So the Syrians retain a foothold in the mountains. And the PLO is besieged in Beirut. The Syrians accept a ceasefire in June, and the PLO fights alone together with its Lebanese allies for the rest of June, July, and into August. I think the ceasefire was August 12th, the day after my daughter's birthday, actually.
Right.
That's why I remember it so easily. And for those months of the siege, it's basically the PLO and the Lebanese forces that are fighting with them against the Israeli army. And I described this both in terms of the Israeli documents that we have access to, the American documents we have access to, the Palestinian materials that I had access to, and my own experiences, having been there during the siege. And then later on, during the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, which are carried out after the PLO was evacuated at the end of August, the beginning of September of 1982.
And I wanted to touch on those massacres, certainly, but there's also one that took place before that in a village that you also had a connection to, right?
Right. You're talking about Tell Zata. Yeah, Tell Zata was a refugee camp. It was actually the largest refugee camp in Lebanon, Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon. And unlike many of the others, it was located in a predominantly Maronite neighborhood. And there was a lot of ill feeling between the locals and the Palestinians. So the camp was besieged in 1975 and ultimately taken in a bloody assault, after which there's a horrible massacre. The number of victims has never been established, but it's in the thousands. Like Sabra and Shatila, both carried out by Lebanese militias, but in both cases with the indirect involvement of the Israelis. And in the case of Tell Zata, the indirect involvement of the Syrians. I quote in the book an account which by an Arab League mediator who arrived in the operations room of the militias that were besieging and about to launch the massacres. And he found Syrian liaison officers in one corner and Israeli liaison officers in another corner. And this was published in Beirut, and everybody disbelieved it until a debate in the Israeli Knesset, when the Labor Party leadership attacks Sharon for Israel's indirect involvement in the massacres in Sabra and Shatila in 1982. And Sharon shoots back. He says, "You guys are doing the same thing in Tell Zata. How can you, Labor Party, criticize me? You were involved in Tell Zata indirectly, the same way that we were involved indirectly. Of course, in Tell Zata really was the Maronite militias that did it on their own, with, as I said, liaison officers from the Syrians and the Israelis. in the case of Sabra Shatila, the Israeli army introduces these militias, sets them on the camp, and illuminates their actions with flares for that night, the first night.
Which is
so it's much more than indirect involvement.
And the last one you described, Sabra and Shatila with the flares, is described quite vividly in Waltz with Bashir.
Right, by Ari Feldman and co-author, I forget the name.
Yeah, I can't either. And I can tell you too, in Nicaragua, in Leon, that's actually where I first learned about that film from two former IDF soldiers, a male and a female, at another guest house. And they said, oh, if you're interested in understanding the conflict, you really need to, because I was interested in Lebanon. And they were saying, you need to watch this film. And the fact that these former IDF soldiers recommended it really lent a lot of weight to it. What do you think about the film in the book?
You know, the film in the book is about the Israelis, really. And it reflects the guilt of one of the authors who, in fact, himself was involved in that operation, apparently firing the illumination shells that enabled the murderers to kill these 1,800, I forget the number of people, over that night and the next day, the previous day, that night, the next day, and into the third day, actually. And I think it's truthful in that it does talk about the massacre exactly pretty much as it happened, and the Israeli role exactly pretty much as it happened. But it's about Israel and Israelis, and it's about it's part of what people have called the shooting and crying genre of Israeli literature on the way in which Israel has dealt with the Palestinians. We're terribly sorry that we're forced to do this. Golda Meir said something particularly offensive that we hold against them, the fact that they make us kill their children or something like that. Right. Basically, not apologizing, basically saying they make us do this. And I think that the Waltz with Bashir is better than that. There's an animated movie. I don't know if you've seen it. There's the book and the movie. And they both they're faithful, I think, to that genre, which is essentially, you know, holding up a mirror to the Israelis as they do these things. And the good thing about it is it recognizes that these are horrible things. The bad thing about it is there's no Palestinian voice there. I mean, the people who are murdered are the ones that we want to know about when there's a massacre, not the massacrers. And in the case of these Israelis, they were not actually carrying out the killings. They were simply making it possible for the killers to do their job. And the guy feels, obviously, an enormous sense of guilt, which is a good thing. It's better than not feeling anything, certainly.
Right. I was thinking that there are kind of these different genres of writers, especially the ones that are kind of getting access to the more popular crowds. So you have the scholars, but you also have activists. And, and you have people, you know, like a lot of Israeli or a lot of Jewish and Jewish American authors, like Miko Peled, for example, and Nilan Papi and Michael Svard, too, in particular. Not all of them have the same perspectives, but it seems like they're kind of apologetic for this, or maybe trying to take it an opposite side. What do you think about that kind of group of people? Maybe.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, they do differ from one another. There's a whole range of scholars, some of whom write popular history and some of whom write more academic history. Tom Segev writes very, very good popular histories. He's a PhD in history, but he writes books that are meant for general readers. He's written 5 or 6 of the best books on this issue. Then you have people like Avi Shleim and Baruch Kimmerling, who's now dead. He's a historical sociologist. Nilan Pape, who are more scholarly, or more, I guess you'd say, more academic, and who differ from one another. They have differing perspectives. Some are much more critical of Zionism than others. Some are much more critical of Israel than others. You have somebody like Benny Morris, who is often described in the same breath as these other figures, and who is very, very different in his politics. He's become an extreme right winger. He said in an interview with Haaretz, with Ari Shavit, he said something like, the only thing that was wrong about the ethnic cleansing that he describes in one of his books is that they didn't finish the job. Wow. So he's gone from being one of the better chroniclers of what actually happened in 1948, why the Palestinians were driven out, how they were driven out, and he's revised that book and added much more detail.
to becoming someone who is, you know, an extreme right winger, and basically says it was completely justified. We had to do what we did, and the only thing we did wrong is we didn't do more.
Wow.
So, you know, that's on the one extreme. And then the other people I mentioned are certainly different places on the spectrum, but far away from Benny Morris.
You mentioned Ari Shavit too, whose recent
Right.
memoir kind of takes, you know, the perspective back to the 1880s, even, right?
Right.
When his first
Right.
forefathers are coming in. Can you talk about him?
Right. Well, he's very much of that genre that I think Morris is part of. You know, it was regrettable, but we had to do it, and if we didn't do it, I wouldn't be here. So screw you. He has a book. I forget the title of it, which basically
My
has
Promised
that
Land.
message. Yeah, exactly. My Promised Land. And I have to admit, I think that book is one of the things that irritated me into writing this book, because he does some remarkable things in that book. He describes a massacre in Lid, the city of Lid, Lidda now, in 1948, which, I mean, there are Palestinian sources that describe it, but for a mass American audience, nobody would have had access to that, to knowing about that. And then he justifies it. He basically says, my daughter and I could not be here, but for whatever. And that's very much the line that Benny Morris has taken, at least, you know, in his public persona. It's his scholarship can still be used, nevertheless, Morris, because, you know, there's this strange schizophrenic thing where he's chronicling these horrors, but he in effect endorses them.
So, of course, a lot of Americans don't really read very much about this unless they're maybe intellectuals or some politicians, perhaps. But a lot of
Academics, right?
Sure, and even so, it's kind of a specialized field, correct? I mean, in order to have access to Arabic-speaking sources or even others than from the region, Farsi, Hebrew, etc., then you have to have kind of that
training,
speak a second language,
right?
Yeah. And a lot of Americans were introduced to the Lebanese Civil War mainly after the attacks on the Marine barracks. And so going back to kind of how, you know, like with Walter Bashir, it's just from the Israeli perspective. And there are films that came out about the Marine barracks bombing, and Americans just see that perspective, but they really don't understand that bigger picture, which includes all these other countries too, and the deep history behind it. It's unfortunate. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to read this book, but if you do read the latter part of it, one of the things you realize is that the United States inserted itself into a situation where Israel had just done what I just described, which is to say, launched an invasion of Lebanon, killed thousands and thousands of people, most of them civilians, installed a puppet regime, drove the PLO leadership out of Lebanon, limited Syrian power, though they never were able to boot the Syrians out. And we reaped the whirlwind. The United States goes in after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, which American diplomats had promised to prevent and did nothing to prevent. I think that's one of the really important things. Those people were killed in spite of an American guarantee that nothing would happen to the civilians who were left behind when the PLO left. So we were involved. We approved the Israeli operation, which led to the creation of a puppet regime in Lebanon, whose militias killed not just Palestinians in Sabra and Shatila, but many, many Lebanese in the south and in the mountains and in other parts of the country. That provokes a restarting of the Lebanese civil war. And the United States is caught in the middle. So the Marines are blown up by people who are really angry at the United States for supporting the Amin Jmeiyah regime and supporting the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. Those Marines and those French paratroopers who are blown up, murdered, are collateral damage of a conflict that the United States endorsed and supported. And helped to wage with American arms. I mean, American arms are supposed to be used for defensive purposes by law. Were they being used in Lebanon during the '82 war for defensive purposes when Beirut was under siege, when Sabra and Shatila massacres took place, when Israel killed all those people? That's a question that everybody in Congress at the time and everybody in the executive branch should be answering. And are they criminally liable? Of course, one reason people keep saying Israel has a right to self-defense, Israel has a right to self-defense, because if they ever use weapons in a way that is not consonant with self-defense, then they're violating the law. And the people who allow them to do it are in some way complicit. And that's one of the beauties of Israel's right to self-defense. I mean, the Israelis have bombed 8 Arab capitals. Is that always self-defense? Israel's occupied the territory of 3 different Arab countries. It's withdrawn from Egypt, but it still occupies Syrian territory and still occupies Palestinian territory, if you call that a country, whatever. Is that defensive? The use of those weapons to do those things and to maintain those occupations? You know, those are questions Americans should be asking, but they don't have the information to ask. We're gonna have to wrap this up.
Definitely, and that's understandable too. If you had written the book in the 1980s, there would have been plenty of material at that point for the previous 7 decades. And so I really encourage everybody out there to check out The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Dr. Rashid Khalidi, as well as any number of other books that are out there looking at these issues, the role of the United States, as well as the state of Israel, and just how complicated this all is. And every little element is important. For me, I think it's important in particular because when people are thinking about whether or not they're going to support a politician who has a certain stance on a war or any kind of foreign policy issue, then they should be as informed as possible on these controversial issues and not just respond emotionally. I want to thank Dr. Rashid Khalidi for being with us today, and wish you a
pleasure.
Happy New Year too. I look forward to any future projects that you're working on, or are you working on something in particular?
I am. I'm hoping to go to Ireland whenever I'm able to do that, to work on a project on settler colonialism, Britain's first and last settler colonies, Ireland and Palestine.
How about that?
But that's a project that's a long way away from, I'm just barely starting it.
Okay, good. Look forward to that sometime down the line. All right. Thanks so much. And thank you everybody for listening in. And episode 4 will be coming up next week too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.